Welcome. Today we are going to travel through time. We are going to walk through cities that no longer exist. We are going to visit kings and queens whose names almost nobody remembers. This is Secrets of Forgotten Kingdoms Explained Slowly. In school you might hear about only a few big names. Rome, ancient Egypt, the Greek city-states, maybe China, maybe the Mongols. But the past was not made only of these famous empires. The earth was once full of many kingdoms. Some were rich, some were powerful. Some were full of art, trade, and ideas. And then they disappeared. Not always in an instant, sometimes slowly, a drought here, a war there, a trade route that moved, a new religion, a new empire. Over time, people stopped talking about them. Their languages were forgotten, their writing was not read. Their buildings were buried by sand, jungle, or simply time. In this video, we will explore some of these forgotten kingdoms. We will not rush. We will move slowly, one idea at a time. So that you can really picture these lost worlds in your mind, we will ask simple questions. Who were these people? Where did they live? What did they believe? How did they rise? And why did they fall? We will also ask one more question. Why did the world forget them? As we go, remember something important. History is not just what happened. It is also what we remember and what we choose to tell. When a kingdom is forgotten, it does not mean it was small or unimportant. It often means something else. We lost the story. Let us begin by understanding what we even mean when we say, Forgotten Kingdom. Chapter 1, What is a Forgotten Kingdom? When we say Forgotten Kingdom, what are we really talking about? We are not only talking about a country that no longer exists. Many countries from the past are gone, but not forgotten. Ancient Egypt is gone as a kingdom, but we still talk about it all the time. The Roman Empire is gone, but it lives in movies, books, and school lessons. These are dead empires, but not forgotten empires. A forgotten kingdom is different. It is a place that was once important, but now most people have never heard of it. There are a few simple signs that a kingdom is forgotten. One, most people don't know its name. If you ask random people on the street about it, they will say, "What is that?" 2, it is rarely taught in basic history classes. It might be studied by experts, but not by most students. 3, its ruins, if they exist, may have been recently discovered or only partly explored. Sometimes the ruins are covered by desert, forest, or modern cities. 4, its language or writing may be hard to read or even undeciphered. Without texts, it is harder to tell its story. 5, it may not have left many written records about itself. Or its enemies and neighbors wrote about it, and those are the only sources we have. But why do some kingdoms become famous and others vanish from memory? Let's slow this down and think about it. 1.1 History is a filter. When we look at history, we are not looking at everything that happened. We are looking through a filter. Imagine you are looking at the past through a small window. Only some things fit in the frame. Some events are close to us in time, or in culture, or in language. Other events are far away, in places we rarely think about. Teachers and writers have to choose what to include in history books. They have limited space. They choose some stories and leave out others. Often they pick empires that controlled huge areas, powers that influenced Europe or the modern West, places with lots of written records in languages we can read, places that left big monuments that still stand today. That filter means many other kingdoms fall outside the frame. They become invisible to most people. This is not always a conspiracy. Sometimes it is just habit and convenience, but the result is the same. Villages become invisible, cities become invisible, kingdoms become invisible. 1.2 The role of writing. Writing is a key reason why some kingdoms are remembered and others are not. Think about the following questions. Did the kingdom keep records? Did it carve stories in stone? Did it write books or tablets? Are those records still readable today? If a kingdom did not write much, or if its writing was on fragile materials like palm leaves or bark or wood, those records may have rotted away. If the writing system was unique and nobody alive today knows how to read it, the records become silent. An example is the Indus Valley Civilization, which we will talk about in a later chapter. We have hundreds, even thousands, of small seals and signs from them, but their script is not clearly decoded, so we can only guess many things about them. Without clear written voices from the past, a kingdom becomes a puzzle of broken pieces. We can see cities, we can see roads, we can see tools, but we cannot hear their own words. That silence makes it easier for history to forget them. 1.3 The power of story. Another key point is story. Some empires were very good at telling stories about themselves. They wrote about great victories. They praised their kings. They carved their histories on walls and obelisks. Over time, those stories spread. Other people copied them. Later cultures admired them. They became part of school lessons, myths, even religions, but not every kingdom did this. Some may have cared more about practical things like farming and trade. Some may have had rich oral traditions, stories told by mouth, that were never written down. When the people who told those stories died, the stories died with them. When there is no strong story, the kingdom becomes easier to ignore. 1.4 Geography and power where a kingdom is located also matters. Kingdoms in places that would later become powerful modern countries are more likely to be remembered. For example, the ancient Greeks are remembered partly because later European culture admired them and kept their stories alive. Ancient Rome is remembered because later European powers saw themselves as its heirs. But a kingdom deep in a jungle, a desert, or a mountain valley, far from later centers of power, might not be seen as important by later historians, even if it was important in its own time and place. This is not fair, but it is how memory often works. 1.5 Destruction and survival. Some ruins survive well. Stone pyramids in a dry desert can last thousands of years, but wooden buildings in a wet jungle may rot away very quickly. If a kingdom mostly used stone, iron, bronze, or fired bricks, it leaves more traces. If it mostly used wood, mud, thatch, or other soft materials, much of it disappears. War can also erase a kingdom. Invaders can burn cities, smash statues, or reuse old stones to build new walls. Over time, this can remove almost all signs of the older culture. When the ruins are gone or hard to find, the kingdom is more likely to be forgotten. 1.6 Forgotten does not mean small. One of the biggest misunderstandings is this: if a kingdom is forgotten, it must have been small. This is not true. Some so-called forgotten kingdoms were once major players in trade, war, and culture. They may have controlled key trade routes, minted their own coins, built large cities, influenced neighbors, lasted for centuries, yet today you might struggle to even pronounce their names. So in this series, when we say forgotten kingdom, we mean something like this: a society that once had real power, wealth, or influence, but whose story is now little known to most people, either because its own records were lost, or because later history chose to focus on other places. Now that we understand what a forgotten kingdom is, let us visit one of them. We will start in East Africa with a kingdom that once traded with Rome, Persia, and India. A kingdom that used its own written script. A kingdom with stone pillars that still rise into the sky. The kingdom of Axum. Chapter 2, The Lost Kingdom of Axum. Imagine standing on a high plateau in what is now northern Ethiopia and Eritrea. The air is cooler than the hot lowlands. You see hills, valleys, and fields. Far away there is the Red Sea. Today this area is part of modern African countries. But almost 2,000 years ago, this was the heart of a powerful kingdom, Axum, sometimes written as Aksum. Most people around the world have never heard this name. But in its time, Axum was one of the great powers of the ancient world. Let us move slowly through its story. 2.1 Where and when was Axum? The kingdom of Axum rose around the first few centuries of the Common Era. Roughly, it was strong from about the 1st to the 7th century CE. Its core lands were where modern northern Ethiopia and Eritrea are today. Axum's capital city was also called Axum. This city became famous for its tall stone monuments called stelae or obelisks. Axum was not an isolated kingdom. It had an excellent position near the Red Sea. This gave it access to trade routes that linked the Mediterranean world, including the Roman Empire, the Arabian Peninsula, the Indian Ocean, India, and possibly even beyond. In other words, Axum stood at a crossroads between Africa, Asia, and to some extent, Europe. 2.2 Axum as a trading power. Trade was the backbone of Axum's power. Through its ports, especially the port of Adulis on the Red Sea, Axum traded many things. Some of them were ivory, gold, frankincense, and myrrh, valuable resins used for perfume and religious rituals, exotic animal products, agricultural goods from its own highlands. In return, Axum imported textiles, wine, metals, luxury items, possibly spices and other goods from India and beyond. We know about this trade from several sources. One famous text is a Greek document called the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, written around the 1st century CE. This was a kind of guidebook for sailors trading in the Red Sea and Indian Ocean. It mentions the region around Axum and its importance in trade. Later, Roman and Byzantine writers also talk about Axum. They saw it as a wealthy and serious power. 2.3 A kingdom with its own script and coins. Axum was not just a place of trade. It was also a literate kingdom. The people of Axum used a script called Ge'ez. Ge'ez is still important today as a liturgical language for certain Christian churches in Ethiopia and Eritrea. Because they had writing, they could keep records, carve inscriptions, spread religious and political messages. Axum also did something we usually associate with major powers. It minted its own coins. These coins were made of bronze, silver, and even gold. Coins often showed the faces of Axumite kings and special symbols. At first, many coins had pagan, non-Christian symbols. Later, they began to show the Christian cross. Coins are very important for historians. They tell us the names of kings, signs of religious change, trade networks because coins can be found far from where they were made. The fact that Axum minted gold coins tells us that it was rich and well organized. 2.4 Religion. From old gods to Christianity, like many ancient kingdoms, Axum's religion changed over time. At first, Axum had its own traditional beliefs and gods. We do not know everything about these early beliefs, but we see hints in old inscriptions and symbols. Then something important happened. In the 4th century CE, under a king named Ezana, Axum converted to Christianity. According to tradition, a man named Frumentius, a Christian who had lived in Axum, helped convert the royal court. King Ezana then declared Christianity the state religion. This was around the same time that the Roman Empire was also adopting Christianity. So around the 300 CE, there were not many Christian states in the world. Axum was one of the earliest. This is why the Ethiopian and Eritrean Christian traditions today are some of the oldest continuous Christian traditions on earth. Their roots go back to Axum. 2.5 The famous obelisks and monuments. If you visit the area around the modern town of Aksum today, you will see tall stone pillars rising into the sky. These are the Axumite stelae, sometimes called obelisks. Some of them are over 20 meters tall. They are carved to look like multi-story buildings with doors and windows, but they are made from single, huge blocks of stone. These stelae were probably built as grave markers or monuments for important people, maybe kings and nobles. They show us that Axum had skilled stone workers, strong social organization, a tradition of building large, symbolic structures. One of the most famous obelisks, often called the Obelisk of Axum, was taken to Italy during the 20th century under Mussolini's rule. It was later returned to Ethiopia in the early 2000s. These monuments are physical proof that Axum was a major kingdom, with the resources to build in stone on a grand scale. 2.6 Axum on the world stage. Axum's rulers saw themselves as powerful. In some inscriptions, they called themselves King of Kings, a grand title also used by Persian and other great rulers. They sometimes got involved beyond their own borders. For example, in the 6th century, Axum famously became involved in the politics of South Arabia, in what is now. At one point, an Axumite-backed Christian ruler controlled parts of Yemen. This shows that Axum had ships and soldiers that could cross the Red Sea and influence another region. Roman and later Byzantine writers listed Axum among the great powers of their age, along with places like Rome, later Byzantium, Persia, the kingdoms of India. For a time, Axum was not just a regional kingdom. It was part of a network of world powers linked by trade and diplomacy. 2.7 The decline of Axum. If Axum was so important, why is it not as famous as Rome, Persia, or Egypt? Several forces seem to have led to its decline. Historians do not fully agree on all the details, but some factors include 1. Environmental change over time. There may have been soil exhaustion, deforestation, or changes in rainfall. This could make farming harder, reduce food supplies, and weaken the state. 2. Shifts in trade routes. When Islam spread across Arabia and North Africa in the 7th century, new Muslim powers began to control many of the key ports and sea routes. The Red Sea and Indian Ocean trade system changed. Axum may have lost some of its advantage and income. 3. Political and military pressure. New powers were rising around Axum. Conflicts, internal and external, could weaken the central authority. 4. Isolation. As Islamic empires surrounded much of the Middle East and North Africa, Christian Axum became more isolated from other Christian centers like Byzantium. By the 7th to 8th centuries, Axum began to fade as a major power. The political center of Ethiopian highland kingdoms shifted to other places, but the memory of Axum survived in local traditions, and the Christian heritage carried on in later Ethiopian kingdoms. Still, in global history, Axum was not given the same attention as Rome or China. Many Western history books barely mentioned it, if at all, until more recent decades. 2.8 Why Axum was forgotten by many. Let us think about why the kingdom of Axum became forgotten for many people in the world. Geographic bias. Much of the older world history taught in Europe and North America focused on Europe, the Middle East, and some parts of Asia. Africa was often wrongly treated as a blank space, except for Egypt. Limited sources. We do have inscriptions and some archaeology, but we do not have as many surviving written records from Axum as we do from Rome or Greece. That makes its story harder to reconstruct. Changing focus. Modern Ethiopia became known for different historical events, such as resisting European colonialism in the 19th and 20th centuries. The ancient Axumite past did not always receive the same global spotlight. Language barrier. Many early European historians could not read Ge'ez or local sources, which further limited how much they wrote about Axum. However, in recent times, more scholars, especially African and Ethiopian historians, have worked hard to bring Axum's story back into view. We now know that Axum was a major Red Sea trading kingdom, an early Christian state, a producer of gold coins, a center of unique architecture and culture. In other words, Axum was one of the great civilizations of late antiquity. It was never truly gone. It was simply not part of the stories that many people were told. Now that we have visited Axum, let us move northwest and then south toward another strange and beautiful place. A city carved into rose-red cliffs, a merchant kingdom in the desert, a people called the Nabateans and their capital, Petra. Chapter 3, the Nabateans and the city of Petra. Imagine walking through a narrow canyon. The rock walls rise high above you. The path is winding and sometimes in shadow. Then the canyon opens suddenly. In front of you, something appears. A giant building, but not built with separate stones. Instead, it is carved directly into the red rock face. Columns, statues, a grand doorway. This is Al-Khazne, often called the Treasury. It is one of the most famous monuments in Petra, the ancient capital of the Nabateans. Today, Petra is in modern Jordan. It is a tourist site and a UNESCO World Heritage location. Many people know it from pictures or movies, but who built Petra? Who were the Nabateans? And why did their kingdom fade away? Let us explore this step by step. 3.1 Who were the Nabateans? The Nabateans were an Arab people who lived mainly in the deserts of what is now Jordan, northwestern Saudi Arabia, southern Syria, and parts of Israel and Palestine. They appear in historical records around the first half of the first millennium BCE, and they became powerful between about the 4th century BCE and the 1st century CE. Their most famous city was Petra, but their influence extended over a wide area. We do not know everything about their early origins. They may have been nomadic tribes at first, moving across the desert with their animals. Over time, they settled more, controlled key oases and trade routes, and built cities. 3.2 Why Petra was special. Petra was special for several reasons. First, its location. Petra sits in a valley surrounded by mountains and rocky formations. It was naturally protected. The main entry into Petra is through a long, narrow gorge called the Sick. This made it easier to defend against attackers. Second, its position on trade routes. The Nabateans controlled parts of the important incense and spice routes. These were paths used to transport goods like frankincense, myrrh, spices, luxury items from southern Arabia and possibly from further east toward India. Caravans carrying these goods passed through Nabatean territory. The Nabateans imposed taxes, sold water, offered protection, and sometimes traded goods themselves. This made them rich. Third, its water management. Petra is in a desert region, but the Nabateans were experts in managing water. They built channels, cisterns, and dams to collect and store rainwater. This allowed a city to exist and even thrive where most people would see only dry rock. 3.3 Carving a city into stone. One of the most striking things about Petra is its rock-cut architecture. Many of the famous structures in Petra are not freestanding buildings. They are cut directly into the red and pink sandstone cliffs. The Nabateans carved tombs, temples, possibly some official buildings and monuments. The treasury with its grand columns and statues is actually a tomb facade, a front carved into the rock for a burial place. There are also many other tombs and monuments in Petra, some simple, some very elaborate. This style of building had several advantages. Stone keeps its shape for a very long time. The desert climate helps preserve the carvings. The dramatic look showed off the power and taste of the Nabatean elites. The Nabateans were influenced by different cultures. In Petra, you can see touches of Hellenistic Greek style, Roman style, local Arabian traditions, possibly Egyptian and Mesopotamian elements. This mix shows that Petra was part of a cosmopolitan, multicultural trading world. 3.4 Nabatean language and writing. The Nabateans used a form of Aramaic script to write their language. Their language itself was related to Arabic. In fact, over time, the Nabatean script is believed to have influenced the development of the Arabic script that is used today in many countries. We see Nabatean inscriptions on tombs, on walls, on religious sites, on objects. These texts help us identify names, titles, and some religious terms. But the Nabateans did not, as far as we know, leave behind long historical texts like some other cultures did. We do not have Nabatean history books written by themselves. Because of this, much of what we know about them comes from archaeology, inscriptions, references by other cultures such as the Greeks and Romans. This makes their story partly silent and gives Petra a mysterious feeling. 3.5 Religion and culture. The Nabateans had their own religious practices. They worshipped different gods, some with names we know such as Dashara, often considered a chief god, Al-Uzza, a goddess. They built temples and shrines. Some of their holy places were simple stone structures. Others were more complex. We also see some betyls or sacred stones that likely represented gods. Over time, under the influence of Hellenistic and Roman culture, some of their deities were connected with or compared to Greek and Roman gods. This process is called syncretism, where gods are blended or identified with each other across cultures. Nabatean art and architecture show this mix of local and foreign styles. Their world was not closed. It was open to ideas from different regions. 3.6 The Nabateans and the Romans. Eventually, the Nabatean kingdom had to deal with a growing superpower, Rome. At first, the Nabateans had a kind of alliance or understanding with Roman authorities. They cooperated in some ways, especially around trade. The Romans respected the Nabateans' control of the trade routes and their knowledge of the desert. The Nabatean kings had their own coins and royal titles. For a time, they remained formally independent. But in the year 106 CE, the Roman Emperor Trajan decided to annex the Nabatean kingdom. It became part of the Roman Empire under the name Arabia Petrea, the province of Arabia. After this, there were no more independent Nabatean kings. Petra continued to exist as a city under Roman rule, and later under Byzantine rule when Rome split and the Eastern Roman Empire survived. 3.7 The slow fading of Petra. Why did Petra decline? There was no single explosion or disaster that destroyed it. Instead, several slow changes seem to have weakened the city over time. One, changes in trade routes. As time went on, some major trade routes shifted. Sea routes became more important than camel caravan routes across the desert. With new ports and new paths, Petra's central position in trade weakened. Fewer caravans meant less money and less political importance. Two Roman and Byzantine priorities under Roman and later Byzantine rule, new cities and military bases were developed. These sometimes took attention and resources away from Petra. 3 earthquakes. The region is seismically active. There is evidence that earthquakes damaged Petra's structures and water systems. Rebuilding may not always have been complete. 4 religious change. As Christianity spread in the late Roman and Byzantine periods, old religious centers changed or lost status. Petra did have Christian churches, but it was no longer a royal capital. By around the early Islamic period, Petra had largely lost its place as a major urban center. Some people still lived there. It was never totally gone. But it was no longer a famous city known across empires. 3.8 Rediscovery. By outsiders locally, Petra was known. But in the Western world, it was almost completely forgotten for many centuries. In the early 19th century, a Swiss explorer named Johann Ludwig Burckhardt heard stories about a lost city of rock in the region. In 1812, disguised as an Arab traveler, he convinced local guides to take him to the site. He became one of the first Europeans in modern times to describe Petra to Western audiences. His reports and later visits by others made Petra famous again in the West. Artists, writers, and later tourists became fascinated. However, this rediscovery story can be told in a misleading way. It sometimes ignores the fact that local people always knew Petra existed. It was never lost to them. It was only lost to European and some other outside scholars. Still, from a global history textbook point of view, Petra and the Nabateans were not often given much space. The focus was more on Rome, Greece, and major imperial centers. 3.9 Why the Nabatean kingdom was forgotten. Let us think again about why this kingdom became forgotten in many histories. Limited written records from the Nabateans themselves. We do not have long Nabatean historical texts. We mostly rely on archaeology and scattered references. Absorption by Rome. Once Rome annexed their territory, the Nabateans stopped being a separate political unit. History books often prefer to talk about empires, not about groups that were absorbed quietly. Shift in trade. When Petra was no longer a key trade center, later writers had less reason to mention it. Eurocentric focus in older scholarship. For a long time, many European scholars focused on classical Greece and Rome and treated nearby cultures mainly as side characters. Despite this, the ruins of Petra have forced the world to pay attention again. You cannot stand in front of the treasury or the monastery without feeling that something big was here once. The silence of Petra speaks loudly. It tells us a powerful kingdom can exist, shape trade routes, develop unique art, and yet almost vanish from the main story told later. Now we have seen Axum, an African Christian kingdom of trade and stone. We have seen the Nabateans, Arab traders who carved their wealth into red rock. In the next chapters, you can continue this journey through other forgotten or half-remembered kingdoms, from the planned cities of the Indus Valley to the bronze and iron powers of the Hittites, to the jungle temples of the Khmer and the stone houses of Great Zimbabwe. Each of them asks us the same question. What else has history quietly left out? Chapter 4, the Indus Valley Civilization. Picture a vast plain, fed by great rivers that flow down from the Himalayas. More than 4,000 years ago, long before the rise of classical Greece, before Rome, and even before many of the famous pharaohs of Egypt, there was a network of cities here. Straight streets, brick houses, drains and wells, workshops and warehouses. We call this the Indus Valley Civilization, also known as the Harappan Civilization. It is one of the world's earliest great urban civilizations, and yet in many school books it gets only a passing mention, or none at all. Let us move slowly and try to see this world. 4.1 Where and when was the Indus Valley Civilization? The Indus Valley Civilization grew up in what is now eastern Pakistan, northwestern India, parts of western India. Its main river was the Indus, but it also included regions around other rivers and now dry river systems. It began to form around 3300 BCE, grew into its mature urban phase around 2600-1900 BCE, and then slowly declined. So we are talking about a civilization that was active over 4,000 years ago, during the same broad era as Old Kingdom and Middle Kingdom, Egypt, Sumerian, and later Mesopotamian cities, but with its own style, its own cities, its own way of life. 4.2 Cities. Harappa, Mohenjo-Daro, and more. The Indus people built several major urban centers. The most famous are Harappa, Mohenjo-Daro, but there were many others: Dhalavira, Rakhigarhi, Lothal, and more. What shocked archaeologists when they first uncovered these places was how planned they were. Imagine walking down a wide street laid out in a straight line. Smaller side streets branch off at right angles. The city is like a grid, carefully organized. The houses are made from fired bricks, often of standard sizes. This suggests a system, some agreed rules about construction. Inside the houses there are rooms, courtyards, sometimes private wells, platforms that might have held beds or other objects, but one of the most surprising things is this. These cities had drainage systems. 4.3 Drains and clean water. In many parts of the world, even in later times, people threw waste into the streets. Sewage ran in open channels. Diseases spread easily. The Indus cities did something different. They built covered drains running along the sides of main streets, pipes or channels from houses leading into these drain structures for managing wastewater, public wells, and bathing areas. In Mohenjo-Daro, we see a famous structure often called the Great Bath. It is a large, sunken pool made of brick, with steps leading down. It was carefully sealed so that it could hold water. We do not know exactly how it was used. It might have had religious or ritual significance. It might have been for some form of public bathing. Whatever its exact purpose, it shows that water, cleanliness, and perhaps ritual washing were important in this culture. The presence of drains, public baths, and many wells tells us that the Indus people cared about water and hygiene far more than many later societies did. 4.4 No big palaces, no giant statues. When we think of ancient civilizations, we often think of big palaces and huge statues of kings. In Mesopotamia, we see ziggurats and royal inscriptions. In Egypt, we see pyramids and temples for pharaohs. In the Indus Valley, something different appears. We do not see clear, gigantic palaces. We do not see giant stone statues of kings saying, "I conquered this," or "I built that." We do see large public structures, like grain storage areas, the Great Bath, big platforms and buildings whose use is still debated. But we do not see the sort of obvious royal propaganda that appears in Egypt or Mesopotamia. What might this mean? Some scholars think that the Indus cities might have been less focused on individual rulers and more organized around merchants, councils, or some other kind of elite group. Maybe they had kings, but they did not show them off in the same way as other cultures. Maybe power was shared. Maybe the ideology of rule was different. We do not know for sure. The lack of clear palaces and monuments to named rulers is one of the mysteries of this civilization. 4.5 The Indus script. A silent language. We know the Indus people used a form of writing because we see it on small seals, tablets, pottery, other objects. These signs are often short, with a few characters arranged in a row. They are sometimes found with animal images like bulls, elephants, or mythical creatures. This is the Indus script. Here is the problem: no one has confidently decoded it yet. Unlike Egyptian hieroglyphs, we do not have a Rosetta Stone for the Indus script, a long text in both Indus script and a known language. We also do not have long text with enough repetition to give clear patterns. So after more than a century of study, the Indus script is still largely unread. This means we do not know what they called themselves. We do not know their myths, their detailed laws, or their kings' names. We cannot read their own voices about their history. We have their streets, their bricks, their beads, their tools, but we do not have their words. This silence is a big reason the Indus Valley civilization is still a forgotten or at least mysterious kingdom for many people. 4.6 Trade and crafts. Even without texts, we can see that the Indus people were skilled craftspeople and traders. They made beads from carnelian, lapis lazuli, and other stones, fine pottery, metal tools, including copper and bronze items, jewelry, and ornaments. We find Indus-style beads and seals far from the Indus region itself. There is evidence of trade connections between the Indus Valley and Mesopotamia, modern Iraq, and nearby areas, regions in Iran, possibly parts of Central Asia, coastal areas leading toward the Arabian Sea and beyond in Mesopotamian texts. There are references to a land called Meluha, which many scholars think may refer to the Indus region. So the Indus people were not isolated. They were part of a network of early global trade. 4.7 Society and daily life. What was daily life like? We have to reconstruct it from objects and buildings. We can imagine farmers growing wheat, barley, and other crops, herds of cattle, goats, and sheep, craftspeople shaping beads, tools and pottery traders organizing caravans and boats, families using wells, sitting in courtyards, grinding grain, cooking. We find toys like small wheeled carts and animal figurines. We find weights used for measuring goods. We find evidence of standard brick sizes. These clues suggest a concern for measurement and order, a sense of urban planning, a society where commerce and craft were important. We also find some figures that might represent gods, goddesses, or sacred symbols. Some scholars have suggested links to later Indian religious ideas like early forms of Shiva or sacred animals, but these connections are debated. Because we cannot read their texts, we must be careful not to guess too much. 4.8 The decline of the Indus Valley civilization. Around 1900 BCE, the great cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa began to decline. Over the next centuries, urban life shrank. Some cities were abandoned, others became smaller. Why did this happen? Scholars have proposed several possibilities, and it may not be just one cause. 1. Environmental change. Rivers may have shifted their courses. Flood patterns could have changed. Some areas may have become too dry or too flood-prone. There is evidence that a major river system, often linked to the now dry Ghaggar Hakra, sometimes associated with the legendary Saraswati, changed or weakened. 2. Climate shifts. Changes in monsoon patterns could have affected crops and water availability. Long-term climate shifts can slowly push people to move, change livelihoods, or abandon large cities. 3. Economic and social changes. As conditions changed, trade networks may have shifted. Political structures may have broken down. Different communities might have become more local and less urban. 4. Invasions or migrations. Older theories talked about invasions by outside groups, but clear evidence of a single destructive invasion is lacking. There may have been gradual migrations and cultural mixing rather than one big attack. Whatever the cause, the result was a slow transformation, not instant destruction. People did not vanish. They adapted. The urban pattern changed, but many cultural elements may have survived in new forms. 4.9 Why the Indus civilization was forgotten for a long time. People simply did not know that such ancient cities had existed in this region. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, when railways were built in British-ruled India, workers sometimes took bricks from old mounds for construction. These bricks came from ancient sites like Harappa. Only later did archaeologists realize that under those mounds were the remains of a lost urban civilization. Several reasons why this world was forgotten for so long. Lack of written histories. Later Indian texts, myths, and epics may contain distant echoes, but they do not clearly describe these brick cities. Undeciphered script. We still cannot hear the Indus people in their own words. That makes it harder to fit them into a clear historical story. Focus on later periods. Much attention, especially in colonial times, was given to later Indian history, such as the Vedic period, the Mauryan Empire, the Mughals, and so on. Archaeology came late. Serious archaeology in the region started relatively recently, compared to the long tradition of studying Egypt or Mesopotamia. Because of these factors, a civilization that may have had tens or hundreds of thousands of city dwellers, advanced urban planning, and far-reaching trade links was left out of many world history narratives. Today, scholars in South Asia and around the world are working to change this. We now know that the story of civilization is not just Mesopotamia and Egypt, then Greece and Rome. It also includes a third great early center, the Indus Valley. As we leave the brick streets of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, we move west and north toward the lands of Anatolia, what is now Turkey. There another kingdom rose and fell, a kingdom that challenged even the pharaohs of Egypt, the Hittite Empire. Chapter 5: The Hittite Empire, lords of bronze and stone in the highlands of central Anatolia, surrounded by hills and dry plains, there once stood a royal city called Hattusa. Stone walls encircled it. Gates were guarded by carved lions and protective spirits. Inside, palaces and temples rose over the rocky ground. This was the capital of the Hittite Empire, one of the great powers of the Late Bronze Age, around 1600–1200 BCE. For a long time, the Hittites were almost unknown outside of a few lines in the Bible. Their own records sat buried, unread. Now we know they were once as powerful as Egypt, Babylon, and Assyria, yet many people still barely know their name. Let us walk slowly through their story. 5.1 Where and when did the Hittites rule? The Hittites ruled much of central Anatolia, which is now part of modern Turkey. At their height, their influence spread into parts of northern Syria, parts of upper Mesopotamia, regions near the eastern Mediterranean coast roughly. Their major imperial period was between around 1650 BCE, rise of the Old Kingdom in Hattusa, and about 1200 BCE, when their empire collapsed along with many others in the Late Bronze Age. The Hittites were not the first people in the region, but they built one of the first large territorial states there. 5.2 A kingdom of stone walls and fortified cities at Hattusa. The Hittites built massive stone walls. If you walk among the ruins today, you can see thick foundations of walls winding over the hills, city gates decorated with reliefs of lions and protective beings, steps and passages leading up to citadels. The city was divided into parts, with an upper city and lower city. There were many temples, especially dedicated to their chief gods. The Hittites also used stone to create rock sanctuaries. A famous example is Yazilikaya, a sanctuary near Hattusa. There in the rock you can see carved processions of gods marching along the stone walls. Storm gods, sun gods, goddesses, and other divine beings are shown in long lines, meeting and joining. These carvings give us a glimpse into their religion and royal ideology. 5.3 The Hittite language and writing. The Hittites did something that helped historians, even though it was forgotten for a long time. They wrote. They used cuneiform script, similar in basic style to that used by Mesopotamians, but adapted for their own language. Their language is now known as Hittite, and it turns out to be one of the oldest recorded Indo-European languages we know of. Indo-European is a big language family that today includes English, Spanish, Russian, Persian, Hindi, and many others. Hittite is a very ancient branch of this family. On clay tablets, the Hittites recorded laws, treaties, letters, myths, religious rituals, royal annals, historical records of the kings, deeds. For many centuries after the empire fell, these tablets lay buried. Nobody could read them. The Hittites were almost invisible. In the early 20th century, archaeologists excavated Hattusa and found huge archives of clay tablets. Scholars slowly deciphered the script and language. When they did, a whole lost empire appeared from the dust. 5.4 Kings, queens, and royal power. The Hittite rulers called themselves great kings. They saw themselves as equals to other great monarchs like the pharaohs of Egypt and the kings of Babylon. The Hittite king was both a war leader, a chief priest for the realm. Beside the king, there was often a powerful queen, known as the Tawananna. The title of Tawananna was passed through certain royal women, and queens could hold serious political and religious authority. Some queens are known by name in the tablets. They wrote letters, concluded treaties, and took part in major events. This suggests that royal women in Hittite society had more formal power than in many neighboring states. 5.5 Laws and society. The Hittites created law codes, similar in idea to the famous Code of Hammurabi from Babylon, but with their own character. These laws cover property and land, marriage and family crimes like theft or injury, slavery, and social status. Interestingly, Hittite laws can sometimes feel less harsh than some Mesopotamian codes. For example, rather than always using death as a penalty, they often used fines or compensation. This does not mean Hittite society was gentle, but it suggests a legal culture concerned with restoring balance and maintaining social order through payments and practical measures. Their society included nobles and officials, free commoners, various types of dependents or slaves, craftspeople and farmers like other ancient states. It was hierarchical, but it also had institutions, councils, and legal procedures. 5.6 Religion. 1,000 gods. The Hittites sometimes spoke of their land as having 1,000 gods. This was not just poetic talk. They had many deities, and they often adopted gods from neighboring cultures. The two most important divine figures were the storm god, often called Tarhana or similar names, the sun goddess. They also honored deities from Hatchin traditions, and earlier people in the region Hurrian traditions, from northern Mesopotamia and Syria, Mesopotamian, and other neighboring cultures. The Hittites were very good at absorbing and blending religious ideas. They used rituals to ask for divine help in war, cure illness, deal with bad omens, protect the king and kingdom. We have long ritual texts describing what to do if there is a plague, or if the king has a bad dream, or if an enemy threatens the land. Religion and politics were tightly linked. If things went badly, famine, defeat, disease, the king might wonder, which god is angry? Which vow did we break? 5.7 The Hittites and Egypt. Clash of empires. One way we know the Hittites were a major power is from their interactions with another giant, Egypt. In the 13th century BCE, a Hittite king named Muwatalli II faced off against the Egyptian pharaoh Ramesses II. They met in a huge battle near the city of Kadesh, in what is now Syria. The Battle of Kadesh is one of the most famous battles of the ancient world. Ramesses II later had inscriptions carved in Egypt, showing himself as a great hero fighting off Hittite chariots. According to Egyptian propaganda, he was a mighty victor. But when we compare Egyptian and Hittite sources, the truth seems more complex. The battle likely ended in a stalemate. Both sides suffered. Neither could completely crush the other. Years later, something remarkable happened. The Egyptian and Hittite rulers agreed to a peace treaty. This treaty is one of the earliest known international peace treaties in history. We have it in both Egyptian hieroglyphic versions, Hittite cuneiform versions. The treaty promised peace and mutual defense, extradition of refugees, recognition of each other's status as great king. To seal the alliance, there was even a royal marriage between a Hittite princess and the Egyptian pharaoh. This shows us the Hittites were at Egypt's level in power and prestige. They practiced diplomacy, not just war. The ancient world had complex international politics, not just constant chaos. 5.8 The mysterious collapse. Around 1200 BCE, a wave of crises hit many parts of the eastern Mediterranean and Near East. Historians sometimes talk about this as the Late Bronze Age collapse. During this time, Mycenaean palaces in Greece fell. Cities in the Levant were destroyed. The Egyptian records mention sea peoples attacking. Trade networks broke down. The Hittite Empire also collapsed during this period. What happened? Archaeology and texts suggest several pressures. One, external attacks. There were invasions or raids from groups on the western and northern edges of their realm, possibly linked to broader migrations and disruptions. 2, internal strain, succession disputes. Internal rebellions or weak kings may have made the state fragile. 3, climate and famine. There is evidence that droughts and harvest failures could have played a role, stressing the economy and society. 4, trade breakdown. When long-distance trade in bronze-making materials like tin and luxury goods collapsed, states that depended on these networks suffered. Hattusa itself shows signs of destruction and abandonment. The centralized imperial system disappeared. However, not everything vanished. Smaller Neo-Hittite city-states appeared later in parts of Syria and southern Anatolia. They carried some cultural and artistic traditions forward, but the grand empire was gone. 5.9 Why the Hittites were forgotten. For many centuries after their fall, the Hittites were almost invisible in history. People in the 18th and 19th centuries knew the word Hittite mainly from the Bible, where Hittites are mentioned as one of the groups living in Canaan. Some scholars thought they were just a minor local tribe. The real massive Hittite empire was unknown because their capital was buried. Hattusa lay in ruins, covered by soil and time. No one in Europe knew where it had been. Their language and writing were unread. Even if tablets were found, early on nobody could interpret them. The Hittite language and its cuneiform form had to be painstakingly deciphered. Historical focus was elsewhere. More attention went to Egypt, Babylon, Assyria, and later classical civilizations. Anatolia seemed to many like a side area. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, excavations at places like Boghazköy, Hattusa, started to reveal thousands of tablets and large city ruins. Slowly, scholars realized they were dealing with a major empire that had signed treaties with Egypt and ruled over vast lands. Today, the Hittites are recognized as one of the great Late Bronze Age powers. But outside of specialized history, their name is still not widely known. They are another example of how a kingdom can be powerful, literate, architecturally advanced, and yet still fade from the global story until archaeology brings it back. Chapter 6 Great Zimbabwe. Stone houses of a forgotten power. Imagine walking across a plateau in southern Africa. The grasslands stretch out. There are gentle hills, scattered trees, and rocky outcrops. Suddenly, you see something unexpected. High stone walls, curving, solid, with no mortar holding them together. Inside, more stone structures, passageways, enclosures, stone towers rising from the earth. This is Great Zimbabwe. For centuries, it stood in silence. Locals knew it. Stories lived around it. But for much of the outside world, Great Zimbabwe was not part of the story of ancient civilization. Some even refused to believe that Africans had built it. Let us slow down and look carefully at what this place was and what it tells us. 6.1 Where and when was Great Zimbabwe? Great Zimbabwe is located in the modern country of Zimbabwe in southern Africa. The name Zimbabwe itself comes from a Shona phrase often understood to mean stone houses or venerated houses. The Great Zimbabwe site flourished roughly between the 11th century CE and the 15th century CE. So, while Aksum and the Hittites were ancient empires thousands of years ago, Great Zimbabwe belongs to the Middle Ages of world history. At the same time that castles were being built in Europe, the Song and Yuan dynasties ruled parts of China. Powerful states rose in West Africa. Like Mali, Great Zimbabwe was a thriving center in southern Africa. It was not a lone building. It was a major city and political center, controlling trade and regional networks. 6.2 Stone walls without mortar. The most striking feature of Great Zimbabwe is its stone architecture. The builders used granite blocks, carefully shaped and placed on top of each other without mortar, no cement, no binding material. Yet the walls stand. Some reach up to 11 meters high in places. They form curving outer walls, enclosures, narrow passageways. There are two main areas that people talk about. The hill complex on a rocky hill, with stone walls and terraces, the great enclosure on lower ground, with a huge curving outer wall and inner structures, including a tall, mysterious conical tower. These structures show skilled stoneworking, careful planning, a clear sense of symbolic space. The walls were not simple fortifications. They seem to have marked elite areas, ritual spaces, and the separation between rulers and commoners. Imagine the impression this would have made on visitors and traders arriving from other regions. A powerful ruler in a city of stone, surrounded by people living in and around this monumental landscape. 6.3 The people and language. Great Zimbabwe was built and used by Shona-speaking peoples, the ancestors of many modern Shona communities in Zimbabwe and neighboring areas. These were African builders using local materials and drawing on local traditions and regional influences. They farmed crops like sorghum, millet. They kept cattle, which were important for wealth and status. They also produced crafts such as iron tools, pottery, beads, ornaments. But the key to Great Zimbabwe's power was not just farming. It was trade. 6.4 Trade networks. Gold and the Indian Ocean. Great Zimbabwe sat inland, but it was tied into a larger world through a chain of trade routes. To the east, on the coast of the Indian Ocean, there were Swahili city-states like Kilwa, Sofala, and others. These cities were part of a trade network that linked East Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, Persia, India. Even, in later periods, China. From inside southern Africa, goods moved toward the coast. Gold from mines in the plateau regions, ivory from elephants, possibly other animal products, and local goods. Great Zimbabwe controlled part of this flow, or at least strongly benefited from it. Archaeologists have found at Great Zimbabwe glass beads likely imported from the Indian Ocean trade, Chinese porcelain pieces, Arabian and Persian goods. These finds show that although Great Zimbabwe was inland, its elite were connected to a far-reaching commercial system. Gold was especially important. It was carried from interior mines to coastal ports, then shipped across the Indian Ocean. The wealth from this trade helped support the rulers and stone-building elites of Great Zimbabwe. 6.5 Social structure and daily life. The layout of Great Zimbabwe suggests a stratified society. The hill complex probably housed the ruling elite and important ritual areas. The great enclosure may have been used as a royal residence, a place for important women of the royal family, or a space for ceremonies. Scholars debate the exact use, but most agree that it was connected with status and power. Outside the main stone structures, there were many dwellings made of mud and thatch. Most people lived in these more ordinary houses. From the ground remains, we can imagine families cooking in open hearths, pots for storing grain, children playing among cattle kraals, enclosures. Smiths working metal, traders coming and going. Cattle were central. They were food, symbols of wealth used in bride wealth and social exchanges. Gold and long-distance trade enriched the elite, but cattle and farming grounded everyday life. 6.6 Myths and misunderstandings. When European explorers and settlers encountered Great Zimbabwe in the 19th century, they were astonished by the stone walls. But instead of accepting that African builders had created it, Many early colonial writers refused to believe this. Some claim that it was built by the ancient Phoenicians, people from the biblical land of Ophir, lost tribes of Israel Arabs, or others. These theories had no solid evidence. They were based on racist assumptions that African societies could not produce such architecture or complexity. Over time, archaeology proved these ideas wrong. Local oral traditions, the style of the artifacts, and the dating of the site all make it clear. Great Zimbabwe was built by African Shona ancestors, not by distant foreign civilizations. But the false theories caused damage. They erased African agency from the story. They justified colonial attitudes. They delayed serious scholarly recognition of Great Zimbabwe's importance for a long time. Even official colonial rule in what was then called Southern Rhodesia pushed the idea that foreigners had built Great Zimbabwe. Only later, with the rise of African scholarship and independence movements, did the true story gain wider acceptance. 6.7 The decline of Great Zimbabwe. By the 15th century, Great Zimbabwe's population and importance had decreased. People moved away. New centers rose elsewhere. Why? As with many declines, there were likely several reasons. 1. Environmental pressure. Large numbers of people and cattle in one region can strain local resources. Overgrazing, deforestation for firewood, and soil exhaustion may have made the area less able to support a big population. 2. Shift in trade routes. Trade could have shifted toward other rising centers, such as Kami or later Mutapa states. New political leaders might have moved their capitals, drawing power and people away. 3. Political changes. Internal conflicts, rival lineages, or changing alliances may have led elites to relocate. Again, this was probably not a sudden disaster, but a gradual relocation and transformation. The stone walls stayed. The city's echo remained. But the main political life moved on. 6.8 Why Great Zimbabwe was forgotten or denied. Great Zimbabwe should in many ways be as famous as castles in Europe, as Maya sites in Central America, as Angkor temples in Cambodia. Yet for a long time, it was not given that place in global history narratives. Reasons include racism and colonial ideology. European powers built a false idea that sub-Saharan Africa had no real civilization before contact with outsiders. Great Zimbabwe directly contradicted this, so they tried to explain it away. Late archaeological recognition. Scientific archaeology in the region developed relatively late, and early researchers were often influenced by biased thinking. Eurocentric curriculum. World history teaching often focused on Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Asia, ignoring African centers of civilization. Over the 20th century, African scholars and their allies worked hard to correct the record. Today, Great Zimbabwe is recognized as a major pre-colonial African city, a center of state-level organization and trade, a symbol of African architectural and political achievement. The modern country of Zimbabwe chose its name partly to honor this heritage. The stone houses became not just ancient walls, but symbols of identity and pride. 6.9 What Great Zimbabwe teaches us. Great Zimbabwe tells us several things about forgotten kingdoms. 1. Power can be inland yet connected. You do not need to sit on the coast or a famous river to be part of global trade. Great Zimbabwe controlled routes linking interior resources to ocean ports. 2. Architecture as message. Stone walls, towers, and enclosures were not just practical. They signaled authority, permanence, and sacred space. 3. History can be erased by prejudice. For decades, colonial scholars tried to deny who built Great Zimbabwe. Bias can be as powerful as time in making a kingdom forgotten. 4. Local memory matters. Even when global textbooks ignored it, the site and its meaning survived in local cultures and names. Now we have walked through a landscape of stone in southern Africa, just as we walked through rock-cut Petra, brick built into cities, and the fortified heights of Hattusa. We have seen that human creativity, organization, and complexity existed in many places, in many forms. Let us end by stepping back and asking, what do all these forgotten kingdoms tell us? Conclusion. Why forgotten kingdoms matter. We have visited the idea of what a forgotten kingdom is. Axum, a Christian trading kingdom of East Africa, the Nabateans and Petra, rock-cut merchants of the desert, the Indus Valley, early masters of urban planning, the Hittites, Bronze Age rivals of Egypt, Great Zimbabwe, stone-walled power of southern Africa. Each of these places was, in its own time, organized, creative, connected to wider networks. Each had people with hopes, fears, skills, and beliefs just like us. So why were they forgotten or half forgotten by so many? Because history is not everything that happened. It is what we choose to remember, what we choose to teach, and what our sources allow us to see. Civilizations with strong survival of texts in familiar languages, direct links to the later powers who wrote history books, big obvious monuments that impressed outsiders were more likely to be remembered. Others like Axum, the Nabateans, the Indus cities, the Hittites' Great Zimbabwe were obscured by lost or unreadable writings, shifting trade and power, geographic distance, colonial and cultural bias, yet they were never truly nothing. They were worlds full of people, art, law, religion, and politics. When we bring these kingdoms back into the story, something important happens. We see that civilization is not owned by any one continent. Complexity is not unique to a single culture. Trade, writing, faith, and power have many centers, not just one. We also learn humility. What we think we know about the past is always incomplete. New excavations, new readings of old texts, new perspectives can change the map of history. Somewhere under a modern city or beneath jungle soil or under desert sand, other forgotten kingdoms may still wait. Maybe their scripts are undeciphered. Maybe their ruins are misinterpreted. Maybe their names are lost. But their people lived. They loved, fought, traded, built, and prayed. They shaped the world in ways we are only beginning to understand. By slowing down, by listening carefully to the stones, the shards, and the silent texts, we can start to hear them again. And that is the real secret of forgotten kingdoms. They remind us that human history is far wider, far richer, and far more shared than the narrow stories we sometimes tell.